Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this special edition of our morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. The results are in. About 360 million Europeans were eligible to vote in the European Parliament election over the past 4 days. In an arena of 27 member states, at least 7 political groups, and a whole range of newcomers and non-attached parliamentarians, it's bound to get complicated. What is more, as many pollsters and experts have shown, for many voters, this election was about national, domestic issues rather than European ones, and so we have to read the results very carefully. Now, it seems difficult to identify one clear European winner. Yes, parties to the right of the center gained seats, including those forming the European People's Party and the Identity and Democracy groups. But building political groups anywhere to the right of the EPP is notoriously difficult, and in some countries, right-wing parties actually underperformed, such as in Sweden or Finland. It would be too simple to declare this election a victory for right-wing populists. It's much easier, on the other hand, to identify the losers. Most dramatically, of course, French President Macron and his liberals in the Renew Europe group lost 9 of their 23 seats, while Marine Le Pen and her Rassemblement National gained 12 seats, causing Macron to announce snap elections last night. In Germany, Chancellor Scholz's Social Democrats received no more than 14%, losing 2 seats, and the Greens are at 12% in Germany, down a staggering 8.5%. In other words, key European government parties have been given quite a beating. Now, what does this mean for the political center of gravity in the new European Parliament? How to interpret the results on the populist spectrum? What are likely scenarios for the formation of political groups and the top jobs? And what to expect in terms of policy priorities, especially in foreign policy? To make sense of some of these questions, I'm delighted to introduce a star panel this morning. First will be Josef, who's a senior associate fellow at DGAP, and until 2019, he was head of the Berlin office at the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR. He held previous roles at the European Policy Center and Bertelsmann Stiftung. Welcome, Josef.
Pleasure to be.
Next will be Sylvie Kauffmann, who is editorial director at Le Monde, and who has worked for Agence France-Presse, AFP, since 1979, with foreign posts in Central and Eastern Europe, Moscow, and the US. She's also a contributor to the FT, the New York Times, and to various formats here at DGAP. Glad to have you back, Sylvie.
Hello, good morning. Thank you.
Last but certainly not least, Nathalie Tocci is director of Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and a member of the advisory council at DGAP. She has in the past advised the EU High Representative Federica Mogherini as well as Josep Borrell, and held previous positions at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, the EUI in Florence, and College of Europe in Bruges. Welcome, Nathalie.
Good morning, everyone.
Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation on the panel in just a moment with about 5 minutes of intro remarks by our speakers, and then open up for Q&A after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, virtually or otherwise, and when invited to speak, briefly introduce yourself and keep your question or comment relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues supporting this morning briefing series, Milan Nitsch, Henning Hoff, Julia Lever, Helga Beck, and others at DGAP. Now, without much further ado, over to you, Josef, from a German perspective on this European election.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. And thanks also for the introduction, because you already laid it out quite nicely. This has been a big loss for the government coalition. Partly because the government coalition seems to be mobilizing a lot of anti-sentiments at this point, and probably the Greens in particular. So this comes as no surprise, but it is quite humiliating that the Chancellor's party has only 14% of the vote. That doesn't look very good. It's a big win on the other hand, for the nationalists, the right-wing parties, on the right and on the left. Remember that this new party, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, is also in essence a nationalist party. And that brings me to the other message. So it's not all about domestics. It's not all about the unpopularity of the current government coalition, but it is also about the discontent in the public about two issues. And the one issue is support for Ukraine, a Russia policy, and the other issue is migration. On both issues, the positions of the far right and the far left, in that sense, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, are quite compatible. They are both anti-migration and they are anti this policy on supporting Ukraine. And I think that has quite a European message to it. And in particular, when you see that about 1 in 5 German voters support that position, anti-migration, anti-support for Ukraine. And when you look to the East, it is 40% of the voters that support that position. AfD, for the first time, is the strongest party in all East German states, which sort of reopens the debate about the East-West divide, even though one has to say that even in the West, AfD has done pretty well, but is not the leading party. Still, the Christian Democrats are in the lead quite clearly when you look at the country overall. Now, what does that mean for German government policy? This coalition government has taken another hit, so it will be more nervous. And it will get more nervous as further state elections continue throughout this year and early into next year. Before there will be the next general election, regular general election in the September of 25. The coalition may not hold, even though there is quite a strong incentive to stick together, because none of the parties can hope to gain from any snap election scenario. So it will very much depend on how they deal with their nervousness. The next big issue they have to come together on is the budget, where there's quite some controversy, and that could become sort of a coalition breaker if that goal all goes wrong. What does it mean for foreign policy? Well, the chancellor, who's very cautious, who's an incrementalist at heart, will take from this election to be even more cautious, to be more incrementalist, to be less outspoken on what his next steps on Ukraine will be, and rather will prefer to let himself be drawn along by events or by the decisions of others. So Germany has no incentive, or the German government has no incentive to take a lead position because it's domestically so weak. And on the EU agenda, it is it doesn't have any clear vision anyway, and this election does not reinforce the desire for change. So we will see more of the same, and the inward focus of Germany will grow, which sort of leads me over to France. This is, from a German perspective, is another East Germany. So it's also 40% of the vote there is clearly nationalist and anti-EU and anti some of the EU policies, like the policy on migration or the policy on Ukraine, where the Greens suffered most in Germany because they were the most progressive, so to say, or the most open in terms of migration and the most demanding in terms of a Ukraine policy. So it's no wonder that when these issues are up on the agenda, that either the Greens win massively or they lose massively. They lost massively. Now, final word on the EU. You see that the political cycles within the EU are not in sync, which for once is also a good message, because some of the trends that are or seem to be alarming in a number of member states level out when you take the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that the coming European Parliament will be more or less like the previous one, with a number of new elements probably that will play itself out over the next 5 years. First, of course, the nationalists are strengthened, and very much things will very much depend on how they will build a faction or a cooperation framework among themselves. Nationalists are not very prone for international cooperation. I think that's a comforting fact, but we will see a strong, reformed, rebuilt, reconstructed right-wing front, which means that on the other side, the need for pro-EU coalition to stick together is larger than even before. So Christian Democrats and socialists need the liberals, and probably they will also need the Greens. This morning, it looks like they don't want to need the Greens, but I'm pretty certain they will, because among themselves, there are so many issues of conflict and discontent that they cannot count on a number or on a consensus among the factions. So I assume that when Ursula von der Leyen seeks a coalition to get reelected, she will have to reach out to basically everyone outside of the right-wing camp in order to secure her position. What does that mean for the EU policy over the next years? I think it will mean that the EU will not improve much. It will continue to muddle along, which may not be such a bad thing, but certainly isn't sort of the grand opening into a new phase of securing Europe's capacity to act or Europe's sovereignty in any way. Thank you.
Thank you, Josef. This is really quite a tour de force, and we'll come back to the formation of political groups and political priorities for this coming legislature. But for now, let me turn over to Sylvie to help us make sense of what happened in France last night and what that means for Europe.
Thank you very much. Well, here we've had, I think, a double earthquake. The first earthquake was the result of the far-right groups, because if you add up the Rassemblement National and the other group, Marion Maréchal's group Reconquête, which got a little bit more than 5% and is getting into the European Parliament, of course. That gets you close to 40%. So this is a big shock, of course, though not unexpected, but it is, I believe, the highest far-right result in the European Union. So for France, it's really something historical. The second earthquake is the decision by Emmanuel Macron to dissolve the National Assembly and call for a snap election in 3 weeks' time, on June 30. So and this is really, this was really a surprise, because as much as the success of the Rassemblement National was expected, I mean, in fact, 31% more or less is in line with what the polls forecast over the past few weeks. Macron's decision came as a surprise and quite a shock, actually. This was the Rassemblement National's wish. Jordan Bardella, who headed the list of the Rassemblement National, had been saying for several weeks that if his party came first, then Macron logically would have to dissolve the National Assembly and call an election. But nobody believed that it would happen, particularly since Macron himself kept saying until yesterday morning that this was a European election, this was not a national election, and that therefore he wouldn't have to draw any conclusion on domestic policy. In fact, he had been mulling this idea for some days, but kept it as a very closely guarded secret so that it would really be a surprise, particularly for the Rassemblement National. I think he probably didn't want to give time to the Rassemblement National to prepare. I mean, 3 weeks for a legislative election, for campaign, is really a very, very short time. It's actually unprecedented in France. What is the calculus behind this move? I think it's twofold. The first part of the calculus is the voice of the reason, is a bet on the voice of the reason versus what the president calls fever and disorder. So he's going to try to mobilize the anti-Le Pen voters, what he calls, or what we call here, the Republican axis, and provoke a reaction from all the mainstream parties and voters, which would prevent the Rassemblement National from getting a majority in the National Assembly. He also bets, I guess, that this was a European election, and that people vote differently. For the protest vote is probably easier on a European election, because there are no national. People don't expect them to have national consequences. I mean, you're not electing somebody who will govern in Paris. While if you vote for a national election, you know the consequences. So Macron probably hopes that people will be more cautious. The second part of this calculus, if this fails, if the voice of reason is not strong enough, and that the voters give a majority in the parliament to the Rassemblement National, then Macron would have to appoint a prime minister within their ranks, probably Jordan Bardella, since Marine Le Pen wants to save her candidacy for the presidential election in 2027. And so in that case, Macron's bet would be that the Rassemblement National would fail in governing, that they would show that they are unable to govern, and then that would be very negative for Marine Le Pen's chances to become president in 2027. So that would mean that we would have what we call a cohabitation between a president from one party and a prime minister from another one, from an opposition party. This has happened 3 times in the Fifth Republic, and twice under Mitterrand and once under Chirac. It did work more or less. I mean, it was workable, if I may say, but these were different animals than Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen. These were governing parties. These were not such radical parties. So we have, I think we would go there into uncharted territory, and this is why this is seen as such a risky bet, Macron's decision. What was the alternative? The alternative was to have a president who would be a lame duck for 3 years, since he cannot run again in 2027, and then we would have 3 years of paralysis, probably, because Macron already since 2022 doesn't have a majority, an absolute majority in parliament, and on the top of which has made running the country already quite difficult since 2022. But that would also, that the position now, the success of the Rassemblement National in this European election would make it even more difficult. So I guess this is part of the reasoning of Macron, that it was better to make this very, very risky gamble instead of having a paralysis for 3 years. Mm-hmm. Very quickly, we don't know what's going to happen during this campaign. Already, we had quite a good show from Raphael Glucksmann on the Socialist Party. So this creates a new situation in the left, because this NUPES, the Union of the Left, was already dead, and La France Insoumise has improved its score, but is now behind the Socialist Party. So will they unite again for this campaign? They are now talking immediately. There were calls for unity during the night in the left, but they have very, very deep differences which have emerged and have been extremely visible during this campaign for the European election. So will they be able to overcome this? This is yet to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Sylvie, allow me to stop you here for a moment. Okay. We will come back to more analysis in a moment, and then also try to understand what this means for the European level. But for now, let me turn over to Nathalie and over to Rome.
Thank you, Jan. So let me perhaps start off by saying that compared to the expectation of this election, the results have both confirmed and invalidated that expectation. So very much confirmed at the national level in the two largest member states, and we've just talked about them, Germany and France. Actually not confirmed across many other countries. And I think it's an important observation to make because, of course, it is consequential on the policy questions that the EU will have to face. I mean, I think, the fact that it was a new Jan were mentioning it yourself, not confirmed in Poland, the Netherlands actually, the Socialists and Greens did far better than expected. They were the first party in Sweden, Finland, Spain, Denmark, even Hungary. Yeah? And I'll come to Italy in a moment. I say this because, not only, and I think this is something that Josef was also saying, most likely it will be the same majority as in the past, but that oddly, it actually puts the Greens that have taken, one of the biggest beatings alongside the Liberals in a very instrumental position. And of course, the Greens, which came out as the big winners from the last elections, that condition made them, let me say, rather intransigent, in terms of being amenable to compromise. I think it's interesting to see whether a different condition, coming out as losers and yet instrumental users, will actually make them more amenable to compromise within a majority. So I think that's a very important space to watch. But let me move on to Italy, because I think Italy also is a case that on one level confirms the surge and on another level actually completely invalidates it, right? Of course, the surge of the far right confirmed, given that Meloni affirmed herself as the first party in the country with just below 29% of the vote. I think also significant in relation to what we've just been talking about, she is the only incumbent from a large member state that actually saw her support somewhat rise rather than fall. And of course, she has been in government for a year and a half already, or over a year and a half already. So I think, looked at from that level, obviously it confirms the narrative of the surge of the right. From a different level, actually, there's a very different story that emerges from Italy. Because, of course, what we're comparing this against was what was the situation like in the last European elections? Well, in the last European elections, another far-right party, the League, did far better than Meloni. So the League in the 2019 elections got 35% of the vote. Meloni now got 29%. If you add onto it the fact that this election also saw the collapse in the support of the Five Star Movement that got about 10% of the vote, and of course they were the governing party 5 years ago, you add all of this together and you basically see, and of course added onto this, the fact that the Democrat Party actually did very well in these elections. In the national elections a year and a half ago, They were just over 20%. They are now at 24%. So you add all of this together, and actually the main picture that comes out is, rather than a surge of the right, you have a sort of rather polarized Italian situation between the hard right and the center left. So, again, at a national level, you have this confirmation and invalidation sort of narrative that also, I think, holds true at European level. Very final thing that I'll say is that, looked at, again, at that European level, the overall impression is, everything changes so that nothing changes. And if it wasn't for the fact that the external context is what it is, I think we would actually be coming out relatively relieved from these elections. The problem, in my view, is not so much what happened over the last couple of days, but rather the fact that, more or less the same, just a tiny bit worse, with a far right that increases from around 20% to 23%, would be not okay, I mean, not great, but relatively okay in normal circumstances. But in circumstances which is as catastrophic as they are, it is potentially really catastrophic, right? So it is clear that the next 5 years will see major challenges to be faced as far as defense is concerned. Of course, our continent is at war, geoeconomics, and how that intersects also with the climate challenge, the enlargement agenda, and how that intersects with the internal reform agenda. These priorities will be set externally. How they are faced and the level of ambition with which they're tackled will be determined by that internal political constellation. And it's in that respect where I think, there's overall, sort of shades of gray, neither black nor white, but not catastrophic narrative coming from the political level. Once you then go down to the policy level, becomes absolutely catastrophic, but more as a consequence of the nature of those external challenges than the internal predicament that the EU is in.
Thank you so much, Nathalie, and thank you for offering a narrative of relief, as you called it, or at least some version of it. Let me come back to the policy level in a moment, but perhaps first on the level of the formation of political groups and a new commission. Now, with all the voter movement that you've described aside, one result seems pretty clear, and that is that the European People's Party, the EPP, gained seats and seemed to be in the position to start talks for the new legislative period, and they have indeed started to do so. So my question, I guess, to all of you is there anything that will prevent Ursula von der Leyen from becoming the next Commission president and from building a new coalition? What are the next steps in line? And then, as I'm asking this question, I'm already inviting people from the audience to post their questions either in the chat or raise their hands, and we'll start the conversation in a moment. But perhaps if you could say a few words about the next steps ahead as you expect them, in the same order as we went before. So Josef, Sylvie, and Nathalie, and then we'll open up.
Well, it seems to me that she has a pretty good chance of being re-elected, but by no means is a given. And it's not going to be a very smooth process. We should not forget that the socialists, for example, SD faction in the European Parliament is not weakened in the way that the Greens and the Liberals are. So they will be quite assertive and will want to see their demands met in any of the talks that I actually assumed to begin very quickly. On the other hand, also those two parties that are needed or will be needed, the Liberals and the have lost, they will, Nathalie, suppose they would be more compromising. They would be more ready to enter the bargain. I think they will in the end do that, but not easily. It will not be, they just can't afford as hit and wounded as they are, to simply say, yes, we agree with everything that EPP and S&D have come up with, but they will want to secure their or some visibility of impact. And I would assume that we will see quite some discussion and a number of test runs to see actually how strong the support for Ursula von der Leyen is. And I would assume that when she gets elected, it may be by a somewhat bigger margin than last time, but it will not be a striking victory. As the council is concerned, the heads of state and government, I would assume that she gets nominated rather quickly. I have thought about the idea of what if Macron would have another idea, but I think Macron now has other fish to fry than to come up with a new surprise candidate. So, and Scholz, I think, actually has no other option but to suggest or to propose to nominate the German, when the German EPP or the German Christian Democrats and the European EPP are so clearly the winner. So I don't think that he has many options either.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Josef. Sylvie, can you hear us again? Is your sound back on?
Yes, I'm sorry. I had a technical problem, but it's apparently solved with another computer. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll bring it back to Sylvie in a moment. We're discussing at the moment the prospects for the next steps and the chances of Ursula von der Leyen to become the next Commission President again. And I asked this question to all of you on the panel, but I'll give you a moment to consider it, Sylvie, given that your audio wasn't working for a moment. So I'll take up Nathalie first and then come back to Sylvie on that question.
Okay, so on one level, well, firstly, I agree with Josef. I think the problem is not going to be in the European Council. I think it's fairly safe to assume that she will be the name that will emerge from the heads of state and government. The question really is what happens in the European Parliament. And here, you kind of do the arithmetic and you say, well, actually, if you put together the 4 pro-European groups and you discount even up to a 20% defection rate, she should be able to get through, right? I mean, just about, scraping through maybe with, 1 or 2 votes, but she should be able to get through. But 1 or 2 votes is, well within the margin of error. So it could not happen, right? I mean, at the moment, I think it's still sort of a reasonable assumption to make that it may well happen. But then the question is, how is it that these different groups are actually going to position themselves? I think, one sort of big question is, of course, which way is the EPP itself going to head? I mean, is it going to head right, or is it going to stick, in a sense, to building bridges to its traditional majority? At the moment, it seems like it's more the latter than the former, but I think that's one question to look out for. Second are the socialists. And, I was mentioning earlier the fact that the Italian Democrat Party did very well. They will push very strongly for the cordon sanitaire, in a sense, with ECR, obviously given Meloni's role in ECR. So, how tough the socialists are in terms of saying, well, never with ECR, I think would also be affecting the calculus of the EPP. Thirdly, I mentioned it earlier, so I'm not going to say it again, sort of how amenable to compromise are the Greens. My suspicion is more than last time round, but I think that's the space to watch. And then finally, let me say something about ECR itself and Meloni in this respect. She's been depicted as, the queen maker and all the rest of it. And of course, that was true up until the election, and it is true up until the vote. But at some point, you need to make your choice. And the truth of the matter is that she doesn't have a good choice. She doesn't have good options. you either have the option of being the small fish in the big pond when no one really likes you, right? And having a split group, because there's no way in hell that I assume PiS would ever vote for von der Leyen. Yeah, and of course PiS is the other party, large party in ECR. Or option two is be the big fish, together with another big fish, Marine Le Pen, in the opposition. And neither of those two options is particularly convenient, especially if, unlike Marine Le Pen, well, let's see what happens with the elections in France, but unlike Marine Le Pen, she is in government in a way in which Marine Le Pen, at the moment at least, is not. So, from queenmaker to really rather, making a rather uncomfortable choice either one way or the other.
Thank you, Nathalie. Over to you, Sylvie.
It was interesting because over the past few weeks, it looked like France's support or Macron's support for Ursula von der Leyen had been weakened, and there was even a lot of people in Paris playing with the idea of a Mario Draghi candidacy. It was something which was really the idea was floated and apparently attractive to a lot of people. I'm not sure it was so attractive to Draghi himself, but maybe Nathalie knows more about this. But yeah, about von der Leyen, you could see that Macron's team was keeping its options open. Now, the thing is that now Macron's influence is terribly weakened on the European scene. I mean, how much of a player is he going to be? This is not 2019. His situation on his political weight is very, very different. He's suffered a humiliating blow this time in the elections. So I mean, from his part, this is we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Now, I agree with Nathalie. The question is very open about how Meloni and Marine Le Pen are going to interact, and these two groups, ID and ECR, how are they going to relate to the EPP and to von der Leyen's candidacy? Just one thing out of this, the other incumbent, other than Meloni, who is confirmed in a way in this election, it's Donald Tusk, who's done really a good showing in Warsaw, I mean in Poland, beating the PiS. So that will be something, and Donald Tusk is EPP, right? So his party is EPP. So we'll see what happens, but that's another card to keep in mind.
Thanks a lot. Looking at the EPP and the likely scenario of forming some form of coalition supporting von der Leyen going forward, there is a question by Jörn Eichhorn in the chat about likely perspectives, what this means in policy terms, because he sounds a little less optimistic and says, well, won't there be a certain change in policies by all parties in a sort of gradual shift to the right, steered by a sort of EPP slightly shifting to the center right? So what does it boil down to in terms of political preferences for the next 5 years? That's one question. There's another question on France by Manfred Eisenbach in the chat. He's asking you, Sylvie, if you could say a few more words about the risk that Macron is taking in calling for the snap election going forward, perhaps having to resign himself should the opposition win in the snap election and put him under increasing pressure. And if I could throw in a question myself for this next round of answers, we haven't talked a lot about the demographics of the vote. There's a story in Germany in particular about young voters going quite heavily for both AfD and small parties, not so much for the Greens as one might have expected. and certainly down, I think, a staggering 23% in the lower age group from the previous election. So that's a very significant change. And looking at this young group of voters, of course, also something that might point into future developments of European politics. So that's another development I'd like to raise. So we've got a question about gradual shift of policies, Macron's risk, and voter age groups. Who would like to start? Nathalie, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for that policy question. Because it allows me to sort of get a little bit more into what I was trying to say earlier. So I think that the policy priorities, in a sense, are already set. I mean, the policy priorities are everything that falls into the defense box, everything that falls into the, let's call it, geoeconomics box, everything that falls into the enlargement box. And I think this was true, 2 days ago, and it's true today, and it's going to be true in the next few months and years. The main difference that this election, the impact of this election and the political institutional cycle that follows is how we go about this. So yes, we're going to be paying more attention to defense, but are we going to continue doing it at national level? I mean, that defense spending is going to continue going up pretty much everywhere, or is there going to be a big fat EU level fund to really spearhead in a meaningful way defense integration in the EU? Most likely, it is difficult to imagine that it's going to be as easy to get, 100 billion sort of next gen EU-like fund for defense in this even only more slight right-leaning EU. Likewise, geoeconomics. Yes, we are going to be dealing with geoeconomic issues. The US-China, sort of competition / conflict is not going to go away. However, how do we deal with that? Are we going to deal with it only through protectionism, which, as in a sense, a more right-leaning EU would suggest, or alongside, in a sense, greater protection, is there going to be, a doubling down on whatever, industrial policy and single market integration at EU level, with that industrial policy having or continuing to have a very green undertone to it? Again, you can do the same thing in two very different ways. Likewise, on the enlargement question, yes, enlargement is going to be a priority. I mean, the war in Ukraine is not going to make it go away. However, are we going to understand enlargement only, quote unquote, in geopolitical terms, driven by a security logic, or are we going to use it as an opportunity to double down on institutional reforms within the European Union? A more right-leaning EU suggests that, unfortunately, it's probably going to be more the former than the latter. So to me, it's the how question rather than the what question in terms of policy, which is going to be most significant.
Mm-hmm. Josef, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Generally, I would agree with what Nathalie has said. My gut feeling about the EPP is that it will not overflow with ambition. It will, EPP will seek to control its role, but the messages that EPP parties send from around the EU is, let's not rock the boat too much. We are not in a period of large-scale Europeanization. So, in the range of options, Nathalie, that you set out, I would assume them to be on all of these issues more on the national side. So we will see a continuation of the fugal trend that has been shaping the EU over the past years. This election result will reinforce that. I think the EPP has little to win with making any advances to the Meloni-Le Pen camp because they would lose so much on the other side. But they will gain a number of points because they can probably strike an easier deal with the Social Democrats, who are also ready to sacrifice some of the climate ambition, for example, in favor of more economic growth or less unemployment. So we will see that as the last 5 years were dominated by issues like the Green Deal, the next 5 years we'll see a sort of a rebalancing of that spectrum between traditional economic growth on the one end and the new economic transformation towards a post-carbon society. So with the decline of the Greens, that claim has lost much of its followership. And I think it is noticed within EPP. You don't need to be appearing green in the same way that you did a number of years ago. Now, as to the young voters, Jan, I'm not so sure what actually is the big driver there. I'm quite surprised, when I'm discussing with my kids and grandkids, I get quite a mixed spectrum. And I don't see that many of the young people that I'm in discussion with are apolitical. But, they don't follow the traditional politics very much. I hope that the big support that you see among the German very young people for AfD is mostly a TikTok phenomenon. But it may not be. It may just be naivete on their part, which may sort of decline as they mature, but you don't know that. But at least it shows that all the calculations that have said, well, young people necessarily are in favor of the Greens. No, there is no axiom like that. Or young people are necessarily in favor of the progressive side. No, that's not the case either. So I think a lot of the assumptions that we traditionally hold as old people about young people more reflect how we felt as young people than how young people feel today. So I think we are not good at actually guessing what drives them. I think what drives them is sort of growing up in a political environment where the boundaries that earlier generations have clearly felt beyond you would not step because of your upbringing, your background, or your educational level, where these boundaries don't exist. And they have to in sort of a borderless political space, they have to find their own place. And that goes along with taking some extreme positions much more easily than we also.
Thank you, Josef. And perhaps that's actually a trend across Europe. If we look at the spectrum, the colorful range of parties, relabels new parties, non-attached parliamentarians, etc., and the increasing struggle for established large parties in many countries, not all of them, as you pointed out, to gain solid majorities and just have incremental increases or decreases in their voter share. So there is a lot to talk about, and that's why we're here. So I want to give Sylvie a chance to respond to the previous questions next.
Yeah, quickly on the demographics, I agree with Josef that young people are not necessarily depoliticized. They engage in politics in a different way. The problem is that many of them in France don't go to vote, and that's still what is deciding of government, making government conclusions. But when they do engage in party politics in France, a lot of them have joined, are supporting the Rassemblement National. We have a lot of young voters among the supporting Rassemblement National, when the older voters tend to vote for Macron and center parties. On France, the question on France, I mean, constitutionally, Macron doesn't have to resign. He's elected for 5 years, and he doesn't have to resign, and I don't think he will, actually. I think he will end his go to the end of his term, and will try to make this bet with the Rassemblement National if he has to, with the Rassemblement National Prime Minister if he has to. But this is definitely a terrible result for himself personally, because he involved himself actively in this campaign. In the end, he was the one who chose Valérie Hayet as to head the list of Renaissance, and I mean she did as well as she could, but she was basically unknown when she started the campaign. So that was not necessarily that was not a good choice from Macron, I guess. So he's, I mean, he's paying quite a heavy price for this result of the European election, personally. And just on the policy issues, I think there are two. For France, of course, it depends on what will be the result of the parliamentary election in July. But if the far right confirms its showing, I think this will cast a big shadow on two issues. The Green Deal, of course, because we have seen that the far right has really been campaigning and been active over the past few months on this issue against the Green Deal. And the second issue would be Ukraine. And this is where I see a lot of problem, because Macron has been quite pushing and leading in the support of Ukraine, but the Rassemblement National was fairly muted, I would say. It was not, Marine Le Pen really muted her pro-Russian views over the past 2 years. But if she wins, if the party wins again at the parliamentary election, it will feel much more free to express its reservations on getting more involvement in support of Ukraine. So this will be a problem.
Thanks a lot. Again, let me encourage people in the audience to come forward and ask their questions in person, which is always more lively and interactive. But I also want to pick up two questions posted in the chat, one by Helmut Hoffmann, and basically asking how to deal with the central message of the election, the preference by many voters across the EU against migration and against weapon deliveries to Ukraine, two trends that you pointed out, Josef. And I wonder, perhaps adding on to this question, acknowledging a preference by many Europeans, not all, of course, for these policies, how to develop the European Union as a whole, as a project, in terms of EU reform going forward over the next 5 years. Is this basically a message to any pro-European party to stop any plans further integrating any progressive steps in terms of building and organizationally developing the European Union further, given this vote of the past 4 days? So that's one question by Helmut Hoffmann. The other question by Thomas Loyek is more specific on the growing discord between Southern Europe and Central Northern Europe. Perhaps that's something that you could pick up. Nathalie, is there an increasing discontent with Eurocentric policies among local populations who feel marginalized or simply indifferent to European policies due to more pressing local issues, is something that Thomas Loyek is asking. Right, where do we start? Josef looks ready to respond. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. I'm picking up the first question because it goes back to the point I was making in my introduction. I believe indeed that this election result will reinforce those within the EU policy framework that want to restrict migration even further. Because apparently this is in a number of member states one of the drivers. Not everywhere, but in some of the large member states, it is one of the most critical policy issues. So I expect their EPP pressing for a more migration restrictive policy course, which will be supported by a rather broad range of governments. Secondly, on Ukraine, the story is a bit more complicated. And I have to return to the German case. I think every second poster in this election campaign had Olaf Scholz on it. And I think at least every third election poster had Scholz on it with the word peace. Now, he was trying to actively sell his person, his role as German chancellor, and his position on Ukraine as sort of the peace formula. And apparently, in the East, 40% of the electorate, and in all of Germany, 20% of the electorate did not buy that. So I think the question is quite legitimate. What kind of Ukraine policy will we see over the years to come? I don't expect a German chancellor to be more forthcoming than before. I would expect him to be more cautious than before, and he was very cautious before, because he has seen that sort of his argument, his positioning did not resonate enough with the electorate. That apparently it is one of the two issues that is driving the polarization of the country, which doesn't do his own party any good. So indeed, and let's assume that the Rassemblement National does well in the national elections, also Macron will lose some of his appetite for that, because simply it will be a constant domestic battle. So I do not expect the EU-Ukraine policy to fall apart, but don't bet on a stronger EU over the next 5 years. No, don't bet on member states getting together and saying, now we're going to equip the Union with the kind of means that it would need to be more effective in terms of supporting Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen. And one last word, EU reform perspective. Don't bet on any major initiative by any major member state to reform the EU in a way that almost everybody in the business of analyzing the EU would deem it necessary to prepare for the next round of enlargement. It will be as before. We will talk about the need for reform, but there will be no reform.
Depressing, but thanks anyway, Josef. Over to you, Nathalie.
So, I mean, on the weapons issue, to be honest, I'm not really that sure that, well, actually, both on weapons and on migration, I'm not sure we're actually going to see changes. I mean, on migration, it's hard to become more restrictive than what we are already, right? I mean, this has been the trend for years. I mean, we have never been particularly open. And so there's going to be, yes, this ongoing push to sign dirty deals with countries left, right, and center. But this is what we've been doing for years, frankly speaking. So I actually don't see any major change there. On weapons to Ukraine, again, I mean, I think the point that Sylvie was making and that Josef was making on France and Germany are very relevant. But at broader EU level, I actually don't see this. At Italian level, I would actually say that the parties that are explicitly against supporting the Ukraine are precisely the parties that did very badly in this election, both on the right and on the left. So this was not a major issue in Italy. And on the question of sort of the north-south, the discontent. Well, obviously the discontent is very strong. I'm not sure it has that clear geographic connotation that it did in the past. I actually think that geographic north-south connotation was much stronger in the past. Now everyone is discontent. Yeah, I mean, this is the big story coming out of Germany. It's not just the story coming out of, Spain or Italy, or so in a sense, we are uniting in our social discontent rather than kind of, dividing ourselves over it.
Okay, since we only have about 2 minutes left, we need to wrap it up soon. And Sylvie, I'll give you the floor in just a second. Perhaps we could find a number of silver linings. Perhaps voter turnout was fairly high. I would like to invite every one of you in your closing statements to find one good message that we can take from this election going forward. And with that, let me hand over in the same order, Sylvie, Nathalie, and then Josef again for short closing remarks and anything that was left unanswered so far.
Okay, very quickly, I think the divide, and that may be a kind of silver lining, the divide is more between France, Germany, which have had strong far-right showings, and a lot of other European countries, including Poland, as I mentioned, where the mainstream part or moderate parties have been resisting. So I think this is both a hope, a source of hope, but also a source of complexity, because we will have to handle this new dynamic very carefully. But it may be a source of hope.
Nathalie?
So silver lining is like mind it. Well, I mean, I think yes, indeed, the fact that this have been the most European elections so far. I mean, still a long way to go for them to be truly European elections, but certainly Europe was more present than in previous European Parliament elections. The fact, and we discussed it, that at the end of the day, that pro-European majority holds, and the fact that, the big problems that we have are at national level. And there is, I wouldn't say there is time to address them, but, I mean, Macron made his gamble, and, I mean, the real question is 2027. In Germany, there is, so basically, we're at the problem at national level, particularly in France and Germany, has surfaced. And I guess the good thing is that when a problem surfaces, at least you're forced to do something about it.
True. And in the German case, regional elections are coming up quite soon. So there is a chance for parties to stand again. Josef, over to you for closing remarks.
Yeah, I think the silver lining is that there's going to be another election to the European Parliament in 2029. Now, this is part of a process. And in this process, as we move on, and I agree here explicitly with Nathalie, we learn. And there are years ahead now of learning about how do we reconcile with that element of discontent that we have found out, and the issues that it polarizes or centers around. And I believe that our political systems, they may not be very impressive in terms of their leadership capacity, but they certainly have an ability to adapt. And we will see that process, and we will see a number of adaptations which take us from 2024 to 2029.
Thank you so much, Josef, Sylvie, and Nathalie, for taking the time and commenting and analyzing on this complicated European Parliament election. The DGAP Morning Briefing series will resume this Thursday, our regular slot, focusing this week on the Ukraine Recovery Conference, which is also going on at the moment, starting in Berlin today. And we will look forward to welcoming all of you in the audience to join us in the future. But for now, let me close with a round of thanks and applause to our excellent panelists. Have a good day and a good week. Bye-bye.